We all know that prisons are meant to be scary. But the reality in the Islamic Caliphates was far less theatrical and far more miserable. No glowing torches or iron spikes, just cramped, damp rooms, broken floors, and the faint smell of straw and sweat. Hunger, disease, and overcrowding ruled. In today's video, we'll explore why it truly sucked to be a prisoner in the Islamic Caliphates, and more. So let's not waste any time, and let's begin. When most people picture a medieval or early Islamic prison, their minds reach for the familiar movie scenery. Iron spikes, flaming torches that someone somehow keeps lit 24 hours a day, stone walls slick with dramatic moisture, and perhaps a hooded guard who has been scowling since the Abbasid revolution. But the truth, and this will be a theme throughout our long, sleepy journey, is much quieter, far less theatrical, and unfortunately, far more uncomfortable. In the Caliphates, from the early Umayyads to the sprawling Ottomans, prisons were not designed to impress or terrify. They weren't architectural statements. They were rooms, sometimes very bad rooms. Instead of cavernous torture chambers, imagine cramped storage areas hastily repurposed to hold human beings. Imagine abandoned bathhouses, unused stables, extra wings of administrative buildings, or old houses no one wanted anymore. Many prisons weren't purpose-built at all. They were improvised solutions to political problems, economic disputes, or a governor's desire to put someone inconvenient somewhere out of the way. If you ever found yourself waiting for trial or punishment, you weren't descending into a stone abyss as a drum beat slowly in the background. You were being shoved into a space that smelled faintly of damp straw, sweat, and the vague disappointment of everyone already inside. The floors were usually dirt or cracked plaster. The walls needed repair. Windows, if your particular cell was lucky enough to have them, were often just unglazed holes that didn't keep out dust, cold air, or curious insects. Lighting was limited. There were no glowing torches lining hallways. Prisoners spent long hours in dimness, their eyes adjusting to a half-light that made even simple tasks, like eating, sleeping, or trying not to trip over someone else's leg, its own sort of challenge. And yet, for all the roughness of the environment, these prisons were surprisingly mundane. There were no masked torturers lurking behind doors, no iron maidens. Those were later European inventions. No spiked pits, and no elaborate devices named things like the rib separator's delight. The danger wasn't theatrical. It was ordinary. It came from overcrowding, hunger, neglect, disease, and the simple reality of being locked away from society in a time before anyone thought prisoners deserved comfort, or ventilation, or even a mat that didn't already smell like 3 other people. One important thing to understand is that prison in the Islamic world was rarely meant as a long-term punishment. Most legal traditions favored swift resolution, fines, public penalties, banishment, corporal punishments, things that ended quickly, for better or worse. Prison was more often a temporary holding place, somewhere to keep you until your debt was paid, your case was decided, or the person you offended cooled down. That didn't make it pleasant. It simply meant that your misery had a rotating cast of cellmates. And why were these people in prison? The reasons were as varied as the prisoners themselves. Some were political troublemakers, critics, rebels, or relatives of powerful individuals who had the unfortunate habit of being born in the wrong branch of the family tree. Others were debtors, caught not because they committed a grand crime, but because their ledger didn't balance at the most inconvenient moment. Others were accused of theft, fraud, or more creative misdeeds. A surprising number were there simply because a governor or official had decided they were irritating. And who enforced all of this? Who managed the building, the rules, the intake of new prisoners? That question leads us to a figure who appears again and again in early Islamic history, the prison warden, or Saib al-Sain. But don't picture a polished officer with a uniform and a badge. Picture instead a man who had too much paperwork, too little pay, and absolutely no interest in your personal comfort. His job was to keep you inside. Everything else was optional. Before we meet him, though, it's important to pause and recognize the unifying theme. No matter who you were or why you were locked away, prison life was universally harsh. Whether you were poor, noble, innocent, guilty, political, petty, or just unlucky. Stepping into one of these makeshift confinement spaces meant stepping into a world of shared discomfort. And that brings us, quietly and naturally, to our next chapter, where we'll explore the surprisingly wide variety of roads that led people into these bare, overcrowded rooms in the first place. If you've ever had a bad day, maybe you spilled your tea, maybe you missed a meeting, maybe someone looked at you the wrong way, you can take comfort in knowing that at least your misfortune didn't end with you being hauled off to a Caliphate prison for reasons that would make modern courts throw up their hands in despair. Because in the vast world of the Islamic Caliphates, from Damascus to Baghdad, from Cairo to Cordoba, the list of things that could land you behind bars was impressively long, sometimes baffling, and occasionally just unfair. Let's begin with the most common culprit: debt. Yes, debt. Not grand theft, not political conspiracy, not daring sword fights on rooftop gardens, just owing someone money. In an era when financial systems were still developing and courts leaned heavily on personal responsibility, failing to repay what you owed could result in confinement until you paid, or until a generous relative rescued you. This meant that some prisoners weren't criminals at all. They were simply broke at the worst possible moment. Many debtors remained in prison, not because their dues were enormous, but because no one had the spare coin or the interest to get them out. The result was a revolving door of merchants, farmers, artisans, and unlucky borrowers, all staring equally blankly at the walls and wondering how life had turned so dramatically sideways. Then there were the political prisoners, a category as old as politics itself. These were poets with too much courage, scholars with too many opinions, military officers on the wrong side of a succession dispute, provincial leaders whose loyalty wavered at the wrong moment, or members of rival dynasties who happened to exist while someone more powerful wished they didn't. Sometimes they were guilty of plotting. Sometimes they merely knew someone who once casually mentioned plotting. In a world where political stability balanced on a knife's edge, rulers saw prison as a convenient way to remove potential threats without spilling blood, at least not immediately. Another well-represented group in prison records were tax offenders. Taxes in the caliphates could be complicated. Different rates for different groups, different categories of land, various exemptions, seasonal changes. And tax collectors weren't always paragons of integrity. A disagreement about what you owed, whether you owed it, or whether the collector was making up numbers as he went along, could quickly escalate into a forced stay in the local sign. Imagine arguing about your tax bill and losing your freedom because of it. Very few people wrote poetry about that, for obvious reasons. And then there were the offenders who had committed moral and religious violations, a category as broad as it sounds. Accusations ranged from drinking wine to insulting respected figures to making statements that sounded suspiciously like heresy. Some were arrested for practicing magic, or at least for owning a suspiciously large number of herbs. Others were jailed for blasphemy, apostasy, or inappropriate public behavior. In a society built strongly on communal norms and religious identity, stepping outside the boundaries, intentionally or not, could draw swift consequences. One particularly interesting group included those imprisoned simply for causing offense. In a world without social media, you didn't risk being canceled. You risked being jailed because a governor overheard your grumbling or because the wrong person didn't like your tone. Being sarcastic to authority was, quite literally, dangerous. It's humbling to imagine how many of us would have struggled to keep our heads down in such an environment. Of course, there were more traditional criminals as well. Thieves, highway bandits, counterfeiters, smugglers. But even here, imprisonment was often temporary, a step on the way to a trial or a punishment. Long-term incarceration wasn't the standard solution, meaning that many who did time were simply waiting for something: a verdict, a payment, a pardon, or the outcome of a political argument happening far above their heads. The common theme among all these roads to prison is unpredictability. You could live an honest life, pay your dues, attend the mosque, raise your children, and still find yourself locked away because someone had an issue with you, or because fate tripped you on an uneven brick. Whether your crime was financial, political, moral, or simply circumstantial, the destination was often the same: a small room full of people whose stories were just as tangled as yours. And that brings us neatly to the man who waited at the end of all these paths, the prison warden, the weary soul responsible for managing the chaos of these crowded spaces. In the next chapter, we'll meet him properly, though he may not be thrilled to meet us. If you've ever worked a job where you felt underpaid, underappreciated, and vaguely confused about why you were responsible for so many things, then you already have something in common with the average prison warden, known in many regions as the Sahib al-Sign. But unlike you, who probably had the option of quitting eventually, the warden's work took place in a world where administrative positions were often tangled in favors, obligations, and political webs. He was stuck in a system that expected him to maintain order with almost no resources and with absolutely no patience. This man, whether working in a cramped city prison or a temporary holding area attached to a provincial palace, had a job that balanced somewhere between bureaucratic nightmare and logistical comedy. Imagine being told you were responsible for feeding, securing, monitoring, and occasionally mediating between dozens or hundreds of restless people, and then discovering that you weren't actually given the money to do any of those things. That was the life of the warden. He was supposed to ensure cleanliness, but no one provided him with cleaners. He was expected to offer water, but funding for wells and storage was minimal. He was told to keep prisoners alive, but was never guaranteed the supplies necessary to make that possible. And on top of all this, he had to manage the endless stream of jailers, clerks, guards, accountants, petitioners, and the occasional wealthy family member demanding special treatment for their beloved imprisoned relative. So, what did he do? The same thing people throughout history have done when asked to do the impossible. He improvised, sometimes brilliantly, sometimes questionably, and sometimes in ways that made the lives of prisoners considerably more unpleasant than they already were. One of his most common solutions was to shift responsibility to the prisoners themselves, or more accurately, to their families. If you were locked away, you didn't receive a state-sponsored care package. Instead, the warden hoped that your relatives, friends, guild members, or neighbors would bring food, blankets, clothing, and, if they were feeling optimistic, bribes. Yes, bribes. The unofficial fuel of historical prison systems. And you can hardly blame him, in a way. If your salary was small, irregular, or entirely imaginary, and you were charged with managing a building full of hungry, irritated people, you might also begin to view small gifts as a helpful lubricant for the machinery of daily life. Bribes allowed some prisoners to obtain better bedding, cleaner corners, or small favors like being allowed outside for a breath of fresh air. For the warden, it kept the place running with fewer complaints. Was it fair? Absolutely not. Was it predictable? Completely. Then there was the matter of security. The warden wasn't a master strategist or seasoned warrior. He was more like a harried supervisor trying to prevent people from slipping out through loose windows, crumbling walls, or incorrectly barred doors. Escapes happened more often than he'd like to admit. Sometimes a prisoner had help. Sometimes they simply saw an opportunity created by inattention, fatigue, or an underpaid guard who had stepped outside for a nap in the shade. And when escapes did occur, it wasn't the prisoner who immediately faced the warden's wrath. It was the guards. If a prisoner vanished, someone had to be blamed. The warden, after all, couldn't punish himself. So, it was usually the unlucky guard who took the brunt of the consequences. This, in turn, created an environment where guards were more focused on avoiding personal punishment than ensuring humane treatment of inmates. Despite all of this chaos, the warden wasn't always cruel. Sometimes, he was just overwhelmed. He was the middleman between state expectations and daily realities. And like many middlemen throughout history, he relied on makeshift solutions, irregular enforcement, sharp instincts, and occasional bursts of desperation. But even with the best intentions, the warden's compromises created a system where prisoners had to rely on one another and on luck to survive. The harshness of prison life didn't stem from dramatic abuse as much as from consistent neglect. Food was scarce, water was limited, comfort was non-existent. And that brings us, quietly drifting forward, to our next chapter. How prisoners managed to survive when even the warden couldn't guarantee their next meal or drink. If you ever needed proof that humans can survive in almost any condition, so long as someone brings them a bowl of something vaguely edible, then the prisons of the Islamic Caliphates would serve as a compelling exhibit. Because inside those cramped walls, surrounded by murmurs, stale air, and the constant shuffle of restless bodies, one truth defined daily life. Nobody was guaranteed food, not even the basics, not even a crumb, not even the slightly questionable bowl of grain mush that appeared only when the warden felt unusually responsible. In most cases, feeding prisoners was not the state's job. It wasn't even the prison's job. The actual responsibility rested squarely on the prisoner's family or friends, or anyone kind enough to care. If your aunt visited, you ate. If your brother remembered, you drank. If your neighbor felt a pang of guilt, you got a handful of dates. If, however, you were alone, far from home, or simply unlucky enough to have relatives who thought you should reflect on your life choices before receiving dinner, well, your stomach learned to negotiate with your pride. A typical day might begin with the thin light of dawn leaking through a crooked window or a crack in the wall. Prisoners would stir, groan, stretch, and immediately notice the same gnawing hunger from the night before. Some waited anxiously for the sound of footsteps, family members carrying clay bowls and baskets, murmuring prayers, or apologizing for arriving late. Others watched the door with quiet desperation, hoping someone, anyone, might bring enough food to share. Meals were rarely private. If a family brought bread, they often tried to smuggle in something extra for fellow inmates who had no one. A pot of lentil stew, a hunk of coarse bread, a few dried figs meant for one man might be divided between 6. Solidarity often grew from shared hunger because nothing builds companionship quite like passing around the last scrap of flatbread while everyone pretends they're not still hungry. But food wasn't the only struggle. Water, oddly enough, was sometimes even more unreliable. The prison might have a clay jar or two, or a well in the courtyard, if you were in a wealthy region, or if the building hadn't been repurposed from something that never expected to contain dozens of thirsty people. Wells dried, jars cracked, guards forgot to refill containers. The result was a daily ritual of negotiation and pleading, with prisoners trying to convince a guard to fetch water without expecting an outrageous bribe in return. And the water itself? Let's just say that clarity was considered a luxury. A cup of clean water was a gift. A cup that merely contained a few floating surprises was still better than nothing. Most prisoners learned quickly not to look too closely at what they drank. Those without family support depended on charity, sadaqah, or zakat, given by compassionate townspeople. Sometimes volunteers arrived with baskets of bread for the entire prison. Other times, wealthy individuals left small amounts of money with the warden to distribute fairly. Fairly, of course, depended heavily on the warden's mood, the moon phase, and whether he'd been bribed 5 minutes earlier. And then there were the prisoners who resorted to sheer ingenuity. Some bartered skills, reciting poetry, sewing clothes, preparing herbal remedies in exchange for bites of food. Others scribbled letters requesting help. Sometimes guards, feeling pity or hoping for a future favor, secretly passed morsels through the bars. Even fellow inmates shared what little they had, understanding that hunger was an enemy everyone recognized. Still, starvation was never far away. people weakened. Illness spread faster when bodies were thin. Hunger made tempers short, and boredom made everything feel heavier. It was a quiet struggle, not always visible in historical records, but felt deeply by every person trapped in those dim rooms. And if you managed to obtain a meal, then came another question. Where would you eat it? Space was cramped, bodies packed tightly, and you might have to balance your clay bowl on your knees while someone else unintentionally elbowed you in the ribs. Which leads us, quite naturally, to the next part of prison life, one that shaped every hour, every breath, and every restless night. If food was scarce, space was even scarcer. And so, in our next chapter, we'll drift softly into that uncomfortably crowded world, the overfilled rooms, the tangled limbs, and the constant reminder that privacy was a luxury for free people. If you've ever shared a room with too many people, maybe at a sleepover, a crowded hostel, or during a family gathering where someone forgot to count chairs, you already know that space becomes a precious resource. Now, imagine that feeling multiplied by 10. Subtract any sense of personal boundaries and add the faint aroma of humanity in various stages of discomfort. Congratulations, you have just approximated the typical atmosphere of a prison in the Islamic Caliphates. Overcrowding wasn't an occasional issue, it was the norm. Most prisons were never designed to hold large populations, mainly because many weren't designed at all. They were mismatched collections of rooms, stairways, storage areas, courtyards, locked corridors, and makeshift enclosures, all pressed into service because a governor or judge needed somewhere, anywhere, to stash human beings. No one consulted architects, planners, or even common sense. Prisons expanded reactively, not intentionally. So when prisoners arrived, they weren't ushered into neat cells marked with numbers or bunk beds. They were directed to whichever room had a patch of floor, not already claimed by a sleeping mat, a bundle of clothes, or someone else's feet. New arrivals squeezed in where they could, sleeping shoulder to shoulder, back to back, or in whatever Tetris-like shape the space allowed. Imagine settling down for the night, trying to relax on a thin mat or ragged blanket, only to realize the person next to you has decided to stretch their leg directly across your sleeping area. Or perhaps the man on your other side snores with the force of a small, determined windstorm. Or maybe someone coughs persistently, rhythmically, through the long hours of darkness. There were no dividers, no partitions, and certainly no privacy. Personal space was a whispered dream, something you vaguely recalled from a kinder life. Ventilation, of course, was another casualty of overcrowding. Airflow suffered when dozens, or sometimes hundreds of bodies shared the same confined area. Windows were small or non-existent. Some prisons had courtyards, but access to them depended entirely on the mood of the guards and the reliability of the doors. In the worst facilities, the air grew stale, thick with heat in summer and cold with breath fog in winter. Those with respiratory problems suffered terribly. Those without them might develop them over time. And smell, well, it was an unavoidable fact of life. Overexerted bodies, poor sanitation, spilled water, damp clothing, unwashed walls, and the general scent of endurance combined into a potent, unforgettable blend. People adapted, as humans always do, but the adjustment rarely came quickly. Because there was no concept of individual cells, everyone shared everything: conversations, fears, stories, arguments, coughing fits, whispered prayers, and the occasional philosophical debate that sparked unexpectedly between strangers pressed shoulder to shoulder. Overcrowding created tension, but it also created connection. In this forced closeness, prisoners learned about one another in ways that free people rarely do. Some found comfort in companionship. Others formed alliances for survival. Still others kept their heads down and hoped not to attract attention. But overcrowding didn't just affect the social environment, it shaped physical health. When people live too close together, illness spreads easily. A single fever could run through the entire room within days. A skin infection might become communal. Dysentery or flu could leap from sleeper to sleeper. The more crowded the prison, the higher the risk of disease, especially when food was scarce, water was questionable, and fresh air was a luxury. Prisoners tried to cope in small ways. They hung cloths near windows to improve airflow. They cleaned corners when they had the energy. They arranged themselves in patterns that minimized conflict: lighter sleepers near walls, loud talkers in central areas, and those who needed help closest to the door. These micro adjustments brought some relief, but they could never solve the underlying issue. There were simply too many bodies in too small a space. And yet, within these tight, uncomfortable quarters, life persisted. People told jokes. They recited poetry. They played small games with pebbles. They shared memories and hopes of release. Even in claustrophobic environments, humanity found its quiet way of softening the edges. Still, the crowding had consequences that no amount of camaraderie could erase. People grew weak, tired, and vulnerable. The close quarters amplified every problem, from hunger to fear. And so, as we drift forward into our next chapter, we turn to the silent force that lurked in every overcrowded room. Disease, the invisible visitor that made prison life not only uncomfortable, but often deadly. If overcrowding was an uncomfortable reality of prison life, then disease was its quiet, persistent shadow, the unwelcome companion who slipped between bodies, lingered in the corners, and waited patiently for an opportunity. In the prisons of the Islamic Caliphates, illness was not a rare outbreak or an occasional visitor. It was a constant presence, woven into the fabric of daily survival, arriving without warning and refusing to leave once it settled in. Disease in these prisons didn't roar dramatically like an invading army. It whispered, it crept, it lived in the stale air that lingered overnight, in the shared blankets that never fully dried, in the hands that passed food from person to person. It was the background hum of life inside the walls, a hum that could swell suddenly into crisis, but even in its quiet moments, it shaped every breath prisoners took. The most common afflictions were the simple, relentless ones: fevers, coughing illnesses, skin infections, and the dreaded chorus of lice that made even the most exhausted man scratch at his scalp in the dark hours before dawn. Every prison had its unique ecosystem of pests, each adapted to survive in close quarters. Lice thrived in hair and clothing. Fleas hid in blankets. Mosquitoes buzzed through cracked windows during warmer months. Each tiny creature carried its own discomfort, its own risks. Then there were the gastrointestinal illnesses, which spread easily when clean water was scarce. Dysentery was a familiar and terrifying visitor. A single contaminated cup or bowl could affect an entire room. Sickness struck suddenly, leaving prisoners dehydrated, exhausted, and vulnerable. Without proper sanitation or medical care, even a mild stomach illness could become a serious threat. Skin ailments were equally common. Rashes, boils, fungal infections, and sores developed from constant friction, humidity, and limited hygiene. A prisoner might notice a small irritation one day and find it swollen and painful the next. In the close quarters of prison life, infection had little difficulty moving from one person to another. No one had personal soaps, ointments, or clean towels. A bandage, if someone was lucky enough to have one, was often improvised from scraps of clothing. Respiratory illnesses, coughs, colds, chronic congestion were inevitable. In rooms with limited ventilation, where prisoners breathed in the same air and dust circulated constantly, a cough could travel faster than a rumor. A single sick man could turn a quiet night into a chorus of wheezing, sniffling, and whispered prayers. For older prisoners, or those already weakened by hunger, these illnesses could become life-threatening. Medical care, when it existed at all, came mostly from fellow prisoners. Some inmates had been physicians or healers before their imprisonment. Others had learned herbal remedies from family traditions. These men became unofficial doctors, offering whatever relief they could with the meager ingredients available. Chewed herbs, warm cloths, whispered advice, or prayers recited over a patient's head. Sometimes they helped, sometimes they couldn't, but their presence brought comfort at the very least. Occasionally, if a prison was attached to a larger administrative complex, or if a wealthy prisoner demanded it, an actual physician might be summoned. But doctors were often reluctant. They knew the risks of entering cramped, unhealthy spaces. Guards, too, were wary. Being near sick prisoners meant exposing themselves to danger. As a result, medical visits were infrequent, rushed, and often conditional on payment or favors. What made disease especially fearsome was its unpredictability. One day, the prison might seem relatively calm, with only minor sniffles and occasional coughing. The next, half the room could wake with fever. The shift was so quick that it created an atmosphere of quiet dread. Prisoners learned to read the air. Was it heavier tonight? Were more people resting than usual? Did someone seem unusually quiet? The signs were subtle but unmistakable. Despite all the hardship, prisoners supported one another. They shared water with the feverish. They helped wash wounds. They traded blanket corners. They whispered encouragement. In a place where institutional help was minimal, human compassion became a kind of medicine. Imperfect, but precious. Still, illness remained an unavoidable part of prison life. It didn't discriminate. The wealthy prisoner with a cushioned mat could fall ill just as easily as the destitute man curled against the wall. Disease reminded everyone that, no matter their past, they were equal in vulnerability. And yet, illness was not the only source of suffering within those walls. In the next chapter, we shift from the silent threat of sickness to the very loud, very visible, and often painful reality of punishment. The consequences imposed before, during, or after imprisonment, shaping behavior in ways that hunger or disease never could. If disease was the quiet, persistent shadow of prison life, then punishment was the loud knock on the door, the reminder that, in the caliphates, prison wasn't always the punishment itself. Often, it was merely the waiting room for something far more immediate, physical, and memorable. Not every prisoner experienced it, but the fear of punishment touched everyone. It hung in the air like a cold breeze, shaping behavior, sharpening anxieties, and reminding the weary inmates that the authorities had many ways of asserting their power, most of them involving discomfort. It's important to understand that punishment in the Islamic Caliphates was not always as brutal as the worst medieval stories from Europe, nor as theatrical as modern films depict. It wasn't all masked torturers, spinning racks, or flaming brands. Instead, punishments were usually practical, straightforward, and intended to serve three purposes: discipline, deterrence, and the reaffirming of communal order. Yet, practical did not necessarily mean pleasant. The most common form of punishment was beating. Not elaborate torture, just a simple, painful reminder delivered by stick, whip, or cane. A thief might receive lashes. A tax evader might endure strikes on the feet. A man who insulted the wrong official could be disciplined with a few strong blows. And while this might sound harsh by modern standards, it was considered efficient, quick, decisive, and requiring no long-term imprisonment. Still, even quick pain can leave lingering memories. Prisoners knew the sound of approaching guards, the subtle change in tone when someone was about to be disciplined, the murmur of voices just before a punishment was carried out. Some men looked away. Others watched, grimly learning from the misfortune of their neighbors. Every blow served as a message to those still waiting in their crowded rooms. Behave, cooperate, and avoid drawing attention. Fear, like disease, spread silently. Another method was shackling, the use of chains or irons to restrict movement. Sometimes these restraints were temporary, used to calm a troublesome prisoner or to prevent escape. Other times, they were part of the punishment itself, forcing a man to remain in an uncomfortable position for long periods. The weight of the metal, the coldness against the skin, and the strain of maintaining posture added layers of discomfort to an already difficult existence. More severe punishments did exist, but they were usually reserved for serious offenses: highway robbery, treason, repeated theft, or murder. These might involve amputation or execution. However, such outcomes typically came after a legal process, meaning the prisons served as places of fearful anticipation. A man awaiting judgment might spend his nights imagining every possible verdict, every possible pain, and every possible future beyond the walls. There were also punishments aimed at humiliation rather than physical harm. A prisoner might be paraded through the market. He might be forced to stand in a public place while people shouted, scolded, or threw insults. This social exposure could be more emotionally painful than any physical blow. Reputation mattered deeply in Islamic societies, and being publicly shamed could damage a person's standing for years. But perhaps the most overlooked punishment was uncertainty, waiting, not knowing. This was the mental burden that shaped prisoner behavior more than anything else. Would a judge show mercy? Would a governor intervene? Would someone pay a fine on their behalf? Would the morning bring relief or punishment? This constant tension made tempers short, nerves sensitive, and nights long. Even those who never experienced physical punishment felt its presence in their imagination. Despite all of this, life within the prison moved forward. People adapted. They learned when to speak and when to stay silent. They read the moods of guards with the precision of seasoned diplomats. They traded warnings, stories, and quiet reassurances. Even in fear, a sense of community formed among inmates, a fragile arrangement built on shared vulnerability. Punishment was a force that shaped prison culture, but it was not the only force. Fear didn't isolate people entirely. It also pushed them toward alliances, friendships, and delicate networks of trust. And that brings us softly into the next chapter, where we'll explore how prisoners leaned on one another, navigating the complex social world behind the walls. In the quiet, dimly lit corners of a caliphate prison, life did not unfold in isolation. Walls may have been thick, and doors may have been locked, but the human need for connection persisted, even among those whose freedoms were stripped away. Here, prisoners learned quickly that survival was as much a social skill as a matter of physical endurance. Friendships could be life-saving, rivalries could be deadly, and the invisible hierarchies that arose often determined who would eat, who would sleep, and who would make it through another night. Friendships in prison were rarely born from shared interests or mutual admiration. Instead, necessity dictated alliances. A debt prisoner might bond with a scholar who could read aloud letters from home. A political prisoner might find camaraderie in someone with a sharp wit and a willingness to barter for protection. These relationships often transcended social status outside the walls, creating connections that could be startling to the outside observer. A tailor and a poet, a merchant and a minor scribe, even men from opposing political factions. Inside the prison, shared suffering was a powerful equalizer. Yet these friendships were fragile. Trust was a precious commodity, doled out carefully and often tested. Stories passed along the prison grapevine, rumors of betrayal, of secret denunciations to the warden kept inmates wary. Alliances could crumble in an instant if one person sensed weakness or perceived an opportunity for advantage. Sometimes, survival meant appearing loyal while secretly keeping an eye on potential rivals. The social dynamics of a prison were a constant negotiation between camaraderie and caution. Informal hierarchies emerged naturally from this environment. Prisoners who were physically stronger often assumed protective roles, but intellect and experience also conferred status. A seasoned inmate could mediate disputes, organize scarce rations, or teach newcomers how to avoid punishment. In many cases, these leaders were neither benevolent nor cruel. They were pragmatic, understanding that maintaining order benefited everyone. Those who ignored the unspoken rules or sought to dominate without skill often found themselves isolated, exposed, and vulnerable. Rivalries, too, were inevitable. Confined spaces amplified irritations and personal grievances. A small insult could escalate into prolonged tension. Disputes over food, bedding, or even sleeping positions could ignite fights. In some prisons, minor quarrels were resolved through formal channels with the warden, but more often, conflicts simmered quietly, influencing daily interactions and alliances. Sometimes, enemies emerged from the most unexpected quarters. A friendly face could turn hostile, a confidant could betray, and one's sense of safety could shift overnight. Yet, even amid these tensions, shared routines and small acts of kindness created a fragile but meaningful social fabric. Inmates who helped each other fetch water, share bread, or care for the sick found a degree of mutual respect that transcended the harshness of prison life. Humor, storytelling, and whispered advice about surviving the warden's whims often provided comfort. In a world stripped of freedom, the simple act of companionship became a lifeline. Understanding these social dynamics is crucial because they shaped every aspect of prison life. The alliances formed in these walls could determine access to food, information, and relative safety. The rivalries and grudges could dictate punishments and social ostracism. The relationships, both positive and negative, created a network of human connection that was as important as any cell door or lock. In a space designed to isolate, human bonds, fleeting or enduring, were a reminder that the spirit could survive even when the body was confined. As one chapter closes in a prisoner's life, another begins with the choices made about trust and loyalty. Friendships were not only about comfort, they were about strategy, survival, and sometimes the faintest hope of connection in a world deliberately designed to strip humanity away. It was these connections, tenuous though they might be, that shaped experiences behind bars, setting the stage for the next lesson. Bribery, corruption, and the subtle currency that ran the daily lives of inmates. In Caliphate prisons, money and favors often mattered more than laws or moral codes. While warden decrees, religious injunctions, and local regulations existed on paper, the reality of prison life operated on an informal economy. Bribery, quiet, pervasive, and sometimes unavoidable, became the lubricant that allowed life behind bars to move, however unevenly. For prisoners, understanding this system was less about dishonesty and more about survival. A few coins or a small favor could mean the difference between spending a night on a cold, hard floor and having a mattress, or between hunger and a modest meal. Prisoners quickly learned that the Sahib al-Sin, the warden, and his aides were human beings with their own weaknesses and needs. They were often underpaid, overworked, and overstretched, supervising rooms packed beyond their intended capacity. A well-timed gift, a few coins slipped into a palm, extra bread offered during mealtime, or a simple promise of labor could tilt the balance in an inmate's favor. These small acts created a parallel economy in which social and material advantages were exchanged with precision, subtlety, and sometimes tension. Bribery was rarely a formal transaction. It was rarely announced aloud. Instead, it was woven into daily life through gestures, favors, and knowledge of the right time to speak. A prisoner might notice the warden lingering near the infirmary and quietly suggest he needs a foot bath or a favor from someone outside the prison gates. Or a small debt could be forgiven with a discreet coin placed beneath a mat. In these micro exchanges, the boundaries of morality blurred. Everyone understood that bending the rules was often a matter of necessity, not greed. This informal system extended beyond the warden. Guards, Clerks, and even fellow prisoners participated in a hierarchy of influence. A stronger prisoner might demand a cut of a newcomer's resources in exchange for protection. Clerks could overlook infractions if persuaded subtly. Knowledge became currency. Who knew when a cell door would be left unlocked? Or who knew which corner was safest from dampness or vermin could be leveraged for small gains. Those who mastered the unwritten rules often experienced better conditions, fewer beatings, and occasionally temporary relief from the relentless tedium. Bribery also shaped social interactions among inmates. Friends and allies pooled resources to ensure that everyone had enough food or a place to sleep. Rivalries could escalate if one prisoner suspected another of hoarding favors or privileges. At times, bribery became a strategic tool. A coin to the right person might secure protection against an aggressive inmate or a safe place to store personal belongings. Over time, many prisoners came to recognize that the survival of one often depended on the careful manipulation of these subtle transactions. This pervasive system was neither uniform nor entirely predictable. A generous offering might be ignored. A smaller favor could yield unexpected benefits, and the effectiveness of any act of bribery depended on timing, perception, and the shifting dynamics of prison life. Moreover, reliance on such transactions carried risks. Exposure could invite jealousy, retaliation, or increased scrutiny. Yet, despite its dangers, bribery was often the only practical path to relative comfort. In a place designed to strip people of autonomy, it offered a measure of control. For historians and chroniclers, the role of bribery illustrates the human ingenuity required to endure confinement. It reveals how prisoners adapted to an environment where official rules were insufficient to guarantee safety or sustenance. These small, quiet negotiations shaped every aspect of daily life, influencing who ate, who slept, who was protected, and who suffered. They also highlight the persistent reality that survival often depended less on strength or virtue and more on the ability to navigate social currents with patience, discretion, and cunning. Ultimately, bribery underlined a fundamental truth of prison life in the caliphates. Power could be subtle, influence could be invisible, and survival was never guaranteed. In this shadow economy, the ordinary coin could become the most valuable tool, shaping relationships, hierarchies, and the rhythms of confinement. Understanding this system prepared prisoners for the rare exceptions to misery, those moments when fortune, strategy, or connection allowed someone to temporarily rise above the hardships of the walls. And with this lesson learned, the path led to a small number of extraordinary inmates, the elite few whose privilege shielded them from the common miseries that everyone else endured. Not all prisoners experienced the same misery. Amid the crowded, grim cells, a small minority of inmates lived under conditions that outsiders might barely recognize as imprisonment. Scholars, nobles, poets, and other elite figures often had access to private rooms, softer bedding, and more reliable sustenance. Their status outside the prison walls translated into privilege inside them, creating a stark contrast to the daily struggles of the majority. For these VIP prisoners, confinement was often more a disruption than an ordeal, though it came with its own peculiar anxieties and expectations. The accommodations themselves could be remarkable. at least by the standards of the time. A private cell meant fewer interruptions, a mattress or mat that was not simply a straw-stuffed slab, and access to water or food delivered more consistently. These small comforts had an outsized effect. A dry, quiet space could protect health, provide privacy, and allow for reflection or study. Unlike ordinary inmates, who often lived shoulder to shoulder with dozens of others, VIPs could maintain some semblance of their daily routines, from prayer to writing to reading. Books and writing materials were prized commodities. For scholars and poets, pens, ink, and scrolls were as vital as bread. Many used these items to record observations, write poetry, or continue philosophical debates, sometimes secretly sharing them with visitors or sympathetic guards. The ability to write was a shield against boredom, despair, and the erosion of identity. Diaries kept by these prisoners would, in later centuries, offer historians invaluable insight into the lives of those who endured confinement, revealing a world of ideas, anxieties, and subtle negotiations that ordinary chronicles rarely captured. VIP status also extended to social interactions. These prisoners often received visits from friends, family, or patrons, and their opinions carried more weight among guards and administrators. Requests for small favors or improved conditions were more likely to be granted. In some cases, their influence extended beyond their cell. A well-connected scholar or noble could advocate for others, negotiate minor privileges, or even subtly alter the environment within the prison. The presence of these individuals introduced a different hierarchy, one based not on strength or cunning, but on status, education, and connections. Yet, privilege did not guarantee comfort or safety entirely. Being noticed for one's status could attract resentment from other prisoners, leading to envy, subtle harassment, or political intrigue. Guards might treat VIP prisoners differently, alternating between indulgence and sudden strictness to assert authority. Moreover, these inmates were often acutely aware that their freedom remained conditional. One misstep, one unpopular remark, could undo any advantages, reminding them that even privilege was fragile. The psychological effects of privilege were complex. VIP prisoners could maintain routines and access intellectual stimulation, which protected them from some of the despair suffered by their peers. Yet, they were also trapped between two worlds, physically confined like everyone else, yet culturally and socially positioned above most. This created a subtle tension, a constant negotiation between gratitude, guilt, and the ever-present awareness of what ordinary prisoners endured daily. Some found solace in their writings or contemplations, while others chafed at the restrictions their status could not eliminate. Understanding these VIP conditions highlights the diversity of prison experiences across the caliphates. Not all confinement was uniform. Privilege shaped survival, comfort, and opportunity. In examining these elite prisoners, one sees the intricate interplay between wealth, status, and influence, even in spaces designed to strip people of agency. Their experiences set the stage for the next chapter, exploring how writing, poetry, and philosophy became not just pastimes, but crucial means of coping and asserting identity behind bars. In a prison world dominated by scarcity, discomfort, and the quiet struggle for basic survival, VIP prisoners remind us that social hierarchies persisted even within walls intended to equalize. The cushions, books, and privileges they enjoyed were both shields and burdens, shaping their days and their legacies. And for those who could write, observe, and reflect, these advantages provided a rare glimpse of freedom within the confines of captivity, a freedom few could claim, and fewer still could maintain consistently. For many prisoners, particularly the VIPs who had access to quiet cells and writing materials, the act of putting pen to paper became a lifeline. Poetry, diaries, and philosophical musings were not simply hobbies. They were shields against the slow erosion of self that confinement threatened. In the dim light of a candle, the rhythm of words could transform a cold, oppressive room into a space of reflection, emotional release, and, occasionally, subtle resistance. In a world stripped of freedom, the mind remained a sanctuary. Prisoners used poetry to chronicle daily life, vent frustrations, and process emotions that could not be spoken aloud. A carefully composed couplet about a leaking roof or a meager meal might seem trivial, yet it captured the essence of confinement in a way that raw complaint could not. Some poets wrote elegies for lost freedom, or lamented the cruelty of arbiters and warden alike. Others celebrated small joys, brief messages from family, the unexpected kindness of a guard, or the fleeting beauty of a sunset glimpsed through a barred window. Through verse, the stark monotony of prison life was transformed into a narrative that acknowledged suffering while asserting humanity. For scholars, diaries served a similar purpose. Recording daily events was both practical and therapeutic. It preserved one's memory and identity in a world designed to reduce people to numbers or cells. Entries ranged from detailed observations of prison routines to reflections on morality, justice, or the wider world beyond the walls. These writings offered structure in an environment dominated by chaos, hunger, and fear. Over time, they became invaluable historical records, providing modern readers insight into the private experiences of those long confined. Collaboration and exchange further enriched prison literary culture. Inmates would recite their poems aloud during brief moments of communal activity, seeking validation, critique, or simply the comfort of shared expression. Even minor acts, like teaching a fellow prisoner to read or helping another draft a letter, strengthened social bonds. Writing became a currency of empathy, bridging gaps between disparate individuals forced together by circumstance. Friendships were reinforced by shared stories, rhymes, and philosophical debates that transcended the ordinary harshness of prison life. Yet, there was also danger in expression. Words carried power, and rulers and wardens were often wary of ideas circulating among inmates. A politically charged poem, a sarcastic line about authority, or a philosophical argument challenging accepted doctrine could provoke punishment. Some scholars and poets were re-imprisoned, beaten, or isolated as a result of their writings. Thus, each word carried weight, not merely intellectual, but practical, with potential consequences. Prison writing was at once an act of survival, a tool for coping, and for some, a subtle form of defiance. The psychological impact of this creative outlet cannot be overstated. In a world dominated by deprivation and uncertainty, poetry and diaries offered prisoners a sense of agency. The act of creation allowed them to assert control over something no warden could confiscate: their minds. Lines of verse, carefully preserved scrolls, and shared stories became quiet reminders of identity, intellect, and hope. Even in the darkest conditions, prisoners found a way to leave traces of themselves behind, small beacons of persistence and humanity. This focus on writing naturally leads to consequences for those who pushed boundaries. While poetry and diaries could soothe and sustain, they could also provoke rulers when ideas challenged authority, highlighted injustice, or revealed uncomfortable truths. In many cases, these writings, meant to preserve dignity, inadvertently became the reason for further confinement or punishment. The delicate balance between expression and survival set the stage for the next chapter: the precarious world of prisoners who found themselves targeted again for the very thoughts and words that sustained them. In the quiet candlelight, prisoners continued to compose, read, and reflect, sustaining themselves with ideas, imagination, and the rhythm of verse. Their words became both refuge and testament, a record of resilience in a world intent on erasure. And through these writings, the story of confinement became richer, revealing not only suffering, but the human capacity to endure, imagine, and remember. While writing offered a rare refuge for prisoners, it was also a double-edged sword. Words, carefully crafted or impulsively scribbled, had power beyond their author's intentions. In Caliphate prisons, a poem, diary entry, or philosophical note could provoke suspicion, anger, or outright punishment. The very act of expression that sustained the mind and spirit could become a reason for renewed confinement, or worse, a brutal reminder of the fragile line between survival and peril. Rulers and wardens, ever wary of dissent, often monitored what inmates wrote or shared. Political commentary, disguised as poetry, satirical observations of prison life, or philosophical musings about justice could be interpreted as criticism of authority. A seemingly innocent verse, lamenting hunger or overcrowding, might carry an implicit accusation, highlighting conditions that officials preferred to ignore. In an environment where perception was paramount, even the most subtle critiques could trigger consequences. Some prisoners learned this the hard way. Scholars who chronicled daily life or questioned doctrine risked isolation, additional fines, or extended imprisonment. Poets who circulated verses among fellow inmates could find themselves transferred to harsher cells or subjected to solitary confinement. In extreme cases, scribbled notes discovered by guards could result in corporal punishment. The tension between intellectual freedom and survival created a delicate dance. One misstep, one line too provocative, and the tenuous comfort of cell life could vanish overnight. This heightened scrutiny shaped the content and style of much prison writing. Inmates developed coded language, allegories, and metaphors to conceal meaning while still expressing thought and emotion. A story about a caged bird might serve as both a poetic reflection and a veiled critique of imprisonment. Philosophical debates about morality or governance could unfold in abstract terms, shielding authors from direct accusations while allowing ideas to circulate among literate peers. These techniques required ingenuity, patience, and careful observation of who might be reading or overhearing each word. Yet, for all the risks, prisoners continued to write. The human need to express, to preserve identity, and to connect with others proved stronger than fear. Diaries remained vital tools for coping, helping inmates process boredom, despair, and uncertainty. Poetry, even under threat, offered solace, humor, and camaraderie. The very knowledge that words could carry consequences also amplified their value. Each phrase became a careful act of defiance, a quiet assertion that the self could endure beyond the limits of the body. The consequences of writing extended beyond individual punishment. Word of a politically or religiously charged text could ripple through the prison, altering alliances and social dynamics. Those associated with a writer might face suspicion or increased scrutiny, while others distanced themselves to avoid entanglement. In some cases, writings could provoke discussions among guards or administrators, leading to minor reforms, but more often they reinforced the precarious balance of power within the walls. Words were never neutral. They were currency, weapon, and shield all at once. Understanding this dynamic illuminates the broader experience of imprisonment in the Caliphates. Life behind bars was not only a matter of physical confinement, but of intellectual vigilance. Prisoners had to navigate complex networks of observation, authority, and peer relationships. Their survival depended on discretion as much as resilience, on timing as much as courage. Those who managed to write carefully, yet meaningfully, achieved a rare synthesis of mental freedom and practical safety. In the end, these experiences highlight a recurring theme of prison life. Even the smallest acts, the quietest expressions, could carry enormous consequences. Poetry and diaries were more than outlets. They were a delicate negotiation with the environment itself. For some, words offered protection, solace, or influence. For others, they became the cause of renewed hardship. In this tension between expression and danger lies a fundamental truth of imprisonment. Survival required constant adaptation, balancing the needs of mind, body, and conscience. And with the stakes of words freshly revealed, the next chapter turns to the broader category of prisoners whose offenses were political. Those whose ideas, allegiances, or family ties made them targets not only for incarceration, but for ongoing suspicion and danger. Among the crowded cells and echoing corridors of Caliphate prisons, a special category of prisoner existed. Those whose very presence posed a perceived threat to rulers, not because of their strength or behavior, but because of their ideas, family connections, or allegiances. Political prisoners were often inconvenient thinkers, rivals, or relatives of those who had fallen out of favor. They were dangerous only in the abstract sense. Their threat lay in influence, persuasion, or potential to inspire rebellion. Yet their lives were treated with the same rigidity as any other inmate. Political prisoners arrived for many reasons. Some had openly opposed a governor's decree or participated in uprisings. Others had simply been associated with someone who had. Occasionally, even a minor insult at the wrong place and time could result in incarceration. Family ties played a significant role. A son, nephew, or cousin of a suspected traitor could be imprisoned preemptively, a warning to relatives or a means to control succession and loyalty. These prisoners often had no tangible crime to their name. Their ideas or relationships were enough to provoke confinement. Life for political prisoners was particularly unpredictable. Unlike debtors or minor offenders, whose routines were somewhat uniform, those jailed for political reasons were constantly under scrutiny. Guards and wardens monitored them closely, wary of secret plots or correspondence. Even conversation with fellow prisoners could be risky. Alliances were fragile, and trust was a luxury. Many political prisoners became adept at reading the moods of those in power, careful not to provoke suspicion, while quietly maintaining dignity and mental resilience. Yet confinement did not always extinguish influence. Political prisoners often retained networks outside the walls. Visitors, letters, or trusted intermediaries could transmit messages, coordinate efforts, or maintain loyalty among supporters. Even within the prison, they could inspire peers, sharing insights, encouraging cautious alliances, or fostering discreet discussions about governance, ethics, or strategy. These exchanges were subtle but potent, reminding both prisoners and wardens that ideas could not be confined as easily as bodies. Social dynamics for political prisoners were complex. Some were treated with deference because of status, lineage, or intellect. Others were resented for perceived entitlement or influence. Inmates often gauged interactions carefully, balancing respect with caution, while navigating hierarchies established by both circumstance and survival. Political prisoners learned early that discretion was as valuable as strength, and that words, whether written, spoken, or merely implied, could shape relationships and outcomes in ways that brute force could not. Punishments for political prisoners varied, often depending on the whims of authorities. Some endured longer confinement than ordinary criminals, isolated in small cells or transferred to distant facilities. Others faced harsher treatment if their ideas or correspondence were discovered. Yet, paradoxically, certain privileges could also accompany status. Scholars, poets, or nobles were sometimes given writing materials, private spaces, or food allowances, as rulers sought to balance caution with the benefits of keeping influential figures alive and ostensibly contained. The psychological toll was significant. Unlike prisoners jailed for tangible offenses, political prisoners faced the constant uncertainty of judgment and suspicion. Their confinement was a reminder of the fragility of favor, and their identity was defined by what they represented to those in power. Survival required not only endurance, but careful negotiation of alliances, social intelligence, and often strategic patience. Success was measured not by days served, but by the ability to preserve oneself, mentally and physically, in an environment where ideas were both shield and sword. Understanding political prisoners illuminates the broader social landscape of Caliphate prisons. They were not inherently dangerous. Their bodies posed no threat. Rather, their confinement reflected the anxiety of rulers confronted with ideas that could shift loyalties, provoke debate, or disrupt authority. By studying their experiences, one gains insight into the subtleties of power, control, and human resilience behind the walls. From here, the story naturally leads to conspiracies and alliances that formed in these cramped spaces, as shared suffering sometimes gave rise to covert movements and the plotting of future change, a reminder that even the most tightly controlled environment could not fully contain human ambition. Within the narrow corridors and crowded cells of Caliphate prisons, survival often depended not only on skill and endurance, but on alliances, sometimes fleeting, sometimes enduring. Shared hardship could forge unexpected bonds, and those bonds occasionally became the foundation for conspiracies. Inmates who might never have interacted outside these walls found themselves negotiating, planning, and quietly maneuvering in ways that could alter life inside and, sometimes, influence events beyond the prison gates. Conspiracies rarely resembled dramatic plots of swords and sudden assassinations. Most were pragmatic, subtle, and cautious, designed to secure basic advantages or to challenge authority in ways that did not invite immediate retribution. Prisoners plotted to share scarce resources, to protect one another from aggression, or to circumvent the ever-watchful eyes of wardens. A small act of coordination, sharing food, swapping work assignments, alerting allies to inspections, was, in its own way, revolutionary. In cramped spaces where freedom was curtailed, even minor collective action was an assertion of agency. The social hierarchy of a prison influenced who could participate in these covert activities. Stronger or more experienced inmates often led, while others provided information, acted as lookouts, or offered skills such as reading, writing, or crafting small tools. Knowledge was power. The inmate who knew the warden's routine, the schedules of the guards, or the weaknesses in a cell's construction became indispensable. Alliances were rarely egalitarian. Trust was earned cautiously, and betrayal was always a risk. Yet, the necessity of cooperation often outweighed personal grievances. Political prisoners frequently played central roles in conspiracies. Their experience, intellect, and external connections gave them insights that other inmates lacked. They might advise on correspondence, devise strategies to protect a group from punishment, or discreetly influence decisions made among inmates. Even those imprisoned for minor offenses found themselves drawn into these networks, understanding that collective action could mean the difference between comfort and misery, or even survival. Not all conspiracies were benign. Rivalries, jealousy, and ambition could transform cooperative networks into schemes of deception or manipulation. An inmate might feign loyalty to a group while secretly undermining it, or leverage information to secure privileges. The constant threat of exposure kept conspiracies delicate and fluid. Participants needed to be observant, patient, and skilled in reading human behavior, for one misstep could invite severe consequences, from beatings to solitary confinement. Despite the risks, conspiracies offered psychological as well as practical benefits. They provided a sense of purpose and agency in a world designed to suppress autonomy. Planning, communicating, and executing even the simplest collaborative acts helped prisoners preserve their identities and maintain morale. Small victories, such as successfully smuggling a letter, arranging a slightly improved sleeping arrangement, or simply protecting a vulnerable inmate, could feel transformative in an environment otherwise dominated by deprivation and fear. Religious and ideological differences sometimes intersected with conspiracies. Shared faith or philosophical outlook could unite inmates across social divides, while competing beliefs occasionally sparked tension or fragmentation within groups. Alliances were therefore as much about compatibility of temperament and priorities as they were about shared suffering. Trust was layered, fragile, and constantly tested, reflecting both the fragility and resilience of human bonds under pressure. Understanding conspiracies illuminates the hidden networks of Caliphate prisons. Beneath the surface of monotony, hunger, and fear, prisoners created systems of cooperation, protection, and subtle resistance. These networks demonstrate that confinement did not erase human ingenuity. Instead, it channeled it into quiet, adaptive strategies for survival. Through conspiracies, inmates maintained agency, supported each other, and occasionally shaped outcomes that even wardens could not fully control. As shared suffering sometimes led to covert organization, it also created tension and conflict, particularly when beliefs or loyalties diverged. This naturally leads to the next chapter, the friction created by religious differences and accusations of heresy within prison walls, where survival required navigating not just scarcity, but ideological divides. In Caliphate prisons, not all offenses were political or economic. Some inmates were confined for matters of faith, or more accurately, for how their beliefs were perceived by those in power. Accusations of heresy, blasphemy, or theological dissent could lead to imprisonment, often without a clear or consistent standard of proof. These prisoners were caught between personal conscience and external authority, navigating a world in which religious expression was closely monitored, interpreted, and sometimes weaponized. The term zindiq was often applied to those considered heretical. Yet, in practice, it encompassed a wide spectrum: philosophical skeptics, heterodox thinkers, religious reformers, or even those whose beliefs merely deviated from a ruler's preferences. Such classifications were fluid, shaped by politics as much as theology. One day, an individual might be tolerated, the next, condemned. In this environment, the boundary between genuine religious dissent and perceived political threat was deliberately blurred. Religious offenders often faced intense scrutiny from guards, clerks, and fellow prisoners. Misinterpretation of a comment, an expression of doubt, or private debate could have serious consequences. For some, imprisonment involved both social isolation and overt monitoring of interactions, ensuring that ideas deemed dangerous did not spread. This heightened surveillance created additional psychological stress, as prisoners had to weigh every word carefully, even in private conversation. Yet, shared belief sometimes became a source of resilience. Fellow prisoners with similar theological leanings could provide intellectual companionship, interpret texts, or offer spiritual support. Informal study groups, prayer sessions, or philosophical discussions became small havens, allowing inmates to maintain identity and purpose. In many cases, religious reflection offered a framework for understanding suffering, imbuing harsh confinement with a sense of order, morality, and hope. Even minimal comforts, a quiet space to pray, the ability to read sacred texts, could preserve dignity and provide structure amid chaos. The presence of religious offenders also influenced broader prison dynamics. Their debates, teachings, or disputes could shape hierarchies, alliances, and rivalries. Some inmates sought their counsel, others feared their influence or disagreed with interpretations. Just as political prisoners needed discretion to survive, religious inmates navigated a complex social landscape where words, gestures, and affiliations could carry profound consequences. Even minor miscalculations, an impromptu argument or a critical remark, could provoke reprisal from guards or fellow prisoners. Punishments for religious offenses varied. Some endured extended confinement, physical hardship, or isolation. Others were pressured to recant beliefs, perform acts of piety, or publicly submit to the authority of religious scholars aligned with the state. In extreme cases, perceived heresy led to corporal punishment or transfers to more severe facilities. Yet, many prisoners found subtle ways to maintain integrity, disguising dissent in allegory, coded language, or philosophical dialogue. These strategies required ingenuity, patience, and courage, demonstrating that intellectual and spiritual survival could be as demanding as physical endurance. Religious imprisonment also intersected with charity and external advocacy. Clerics, scholars, or family members sometimes interceded on behalf of inmates, offering letters, food, or legal appeals. These efforts created another layer of social negotiation in which belief, reputation, and status influenced daily life. Understanding these dynamics underscores that imprisonment was not merely a physical constraint, but a deeply social and psychological experience, shaped by networks of care, influence, and negotiation. The experiences of religious offenders illuminate the blurred line between belief and power, conscience and coercion. In cramped, tense conditions, survival demanded more than adherence to rules. It required wisdom, patience, and strategic discretion. These prisoners navigated moral, intellectual, and social challenges, reminding us that the walls of a cell could not contain thought or faith entirely. From here, the next chapter naturally turns to those rare moments when mercy, charity, or aid alleviated suffering, revealing that even in environments designed for deprivation, human compassion could persist, shaping lives in unexpected ways. Even in the bleakest corners of Caliphate prisons, acts of compassion persisted, small but profoundly meaningful. Though daily life was dominated by scarcity, hunger, and discomfort, prisoners occasionally encountered mercy, moments that reminded them that humanity could survive even behind walls. These acts came from fellow inmates, families outside the gates, and occasionally from guards, clerics, or local communities, creating fleeting but vital reprieves from the relentless grind of confinement. Families played a crucial role in sustaining prisoners. Letters, food parcels, and coins were lifelines, delivering both material support and emotional reassurance. A simple loaf of bread or a note from a loved one could restore hope and maintain the fragile connection between the imprisoned and the world outside. In some cases, families negotiated with wardens, providing gifts or favors to improve conditions for their relatives. These interventions were often delicate exercises in social diplomacy, requiring persistence, ingenuity, and an understanding of local hierarchies. Charitable networks also extended beyond family. In many Islamic cities, community, organizations, and religious institutions practiced zakat, or almsgiving, which occasionally benefited prisoners. Donations might include food, clothing, blankets, or even books. Clerics and scholars sometimes advocated for specific inmates, offering both spiritual and practical support. Such interventions underscored the broader societal understanding that, while punishment was necessary, the human dignity of prisoners remained a concern. These gestures were neither systematic nor universal, but they provided critical relief to those fortunate enough to receive them. Even within prison walls, inmates showed care for one another, sharing food, assisting the sick, or offering protection from aggressive peers were common forms of micro-charity. Small, deliberate acts, helping another clean their bedding, retrieving water, or quietly supporting someone struggling with despair, fostered a sense of community. These gestures reinforced bonds, mitigated isolation, and in some cases, saved lives. In an environment designed to strip away autonomy, such acts of kindness were expressions of agency and moral resilience. Mercy also sometimes appeared in the form of leniency from those in authority. A warden might overlook a minor infraction, allow access to better bedding, or reduce punishment in response to petitions or gifts. These decisions were rarely predictable and often depended on mood, bribery, or external pressure, but they demonstrated that prison life was not entirely governed by rigid rules. Moments of mercy highlighted the human dimensions of authority, reminding prisoners that even those in power were not monolithic. The psychological impact of these interventions was significant. Even brief reprieves could provide hope, preserve dignity, and sustain motivation. Knowing that compassion existed, even sporadically, helped prisoners endure monotony, hunger, and fear. It offered proof that their lives mattered, that connections, both inside and outside, retained meaning, and that the world beyond the walls continued to exist with some sense of justice or empathy. Acts of charity and mercy were also subtle reminders of the complex social fabric of the Caliphates. Prisoners were not isolated from the broader society. They were entangled in networks of family, faith, and community that could shape their experience in unexpected ways. Understanding these networks illuminates how society, even indirectly, influenced life behind bars, mitigating the worst effects of neglect and cruelty. These rare moments of kindness set the stage for acts of daring, such as escape attempts, and the consequences that followed when prisoners sought to reclaim freedom. In understanding charity and mercy, one sees the delicate interplay between vulnerability and resilience, deprivation and hope, oppression and human compassion. The next chapter naturally turns to those desperate, audacious, and often ill-fated attempts to escape, where hope and risk collided in the confined and unforgiving world of Caliphate prisons. In the harsh reality of Caliphate prisons, the idea of escape often glimmered in the minds of inmates as a tantalizing dream. The cramped cells, overcrowded corridors, and constant deprivation made the prospect of freedom irresistible. Yet, the odds were overwhelmingly against success. Escape attempts were fraught with danger, rarely well planned, and almost always punished severely when discovered. Still, the thought persisted, and for many prisoners, it represented a fragile hope, a mental refuge, even if physical liberation remained unlikely. Planning an escape required knowledge, timing, and cooperation. Inmates had to navigate guards' routines, structural weaknesses in cells, and the informal hierarchies that dominated prisoner interactions. Some relied on observation, noting when doors were unlocked, which corridors were less patrolled, or when certain guards were distracted. Others used makeshift tools, ropes of braided clothing, crude picks fashioned from scrap metal, or contraband keys, desperately improvising with whatever resources were available. The creativity required to attempt escape highlighted both the ingenuity and sheer audacity of those confined. Collaboration was common but complicated. Allies were necessary for digging, lookout duties, or creating diversions, yet trust was fragile. One misstep could expose the entire group. Prisoners sometimes recruited unlikely accomplices. A political prisoner with knowledge of the guard routines, a religious offender skilled in secrecy, or even a fellow debtor whose desperation matched their own. Alliances were forged out of necessity rather than friendship, and betrayal lurked in every shadow. A single misjudgment could turn hope into catastrophe. Despite careful planning, escape attempts rarely succeeded. The architecture of prisons, often built to withstand rebellion, combined with attentive guards and complex social networks of informants, made evasion extremely difficult. Even a small error, misjudging a guard's patrol, dropping a tool, or drawing attention with noise, could result in immediate capture. For most prisoners, the dream of freedom remained that, a dream, a mental refuge rather than a tangible outcome. Humor and ingenuity sometimes accompanied failure. Historical accounts describe attempts ranging from the clever to the absurd, disguises fashioned from rags, tunnels dug with spoons, and letters used as decoys. Though these efforts rarely resulted in freedom, they showcased the resourcefulness of those confined, as well as their resilience in the face of relentless deprivation. Even failed attempts offered lessons about guard behavior, prison routines, and the limits of human endurance that could inform future efforts or simply provide a sense of agency. The consequences of failure were severe. Prisoners caught trying to escape faced extended confinement, physical punishment, and heightened surveillance. Their allies were often implicated, punished, or relocated. Repercussions could ripple through the prison, reinforcing fear and discouraging subsequent attempts. Yet, even in the face of harsh consequences, the instinct to seek freedom persisted. The human desire to reclaim autonomy was so powerful that, despite repeated failures, some prisoners continued to imagine and plan escape. Escape attempts also highlight the interplay of social dynamics and survival strategies. Those who tried and failed often relied on the kindness of others to recover from injuries or humiliation. Observant prisoners learned from these episodes, understanding not only the physical challenges but also the psychological ones, maintaining morale, balancing risk, and navigating the informal rules of the prison environment. These experiences revealed that even in a world designed to restrict, ingenuity, courage, and cooperation remained vital forms of resistance. Understanding the allure and peril of escape prepares us for the next chapter. The consequences when these attempts failed, and the heightened vigilance and punishment that followed. Here, the harsh realities of prison life were made strikingly clear. emphasizing the constant tension between hope and risk, ambition and survival. Escape, as alluring as it was, rarely ended in freedom. In Caliphate prisons, most attempts failed, and failure brought consequences that could be severe, immediate, and far-reaching. The few who succeeded were exceptions remembered in whispers, while the majority endured the compounded hardships of capture, punishment, and heightened surveillance. Understanding the aftermath of failed escapes is essential to appreciating the daily reality of prison life, the careful balance of risk, hope, and survival. Punishments for failed escape attempts were designed to serve as deterrents, both for the individual and for fellow prisoners. Those caught were often subjected to corporal punishment, beatings, shackling, or enforced labor. Solitary confinement was a common method of control, isolating the would-be escapee to break morale and reinforce authority. In some cases, prisoners were relocated to more secure facilities, disrupting existing alliances and social networks. The consequences extended beyond physical suffering, striking at the emotional and psychological resilience of inmates. Heightened surveillance was another inevitable result. Guards, once lax or distracted, now scrutinized every movement. Schedules for meals, work assignments, and cell inspections became more rigid and frequent. Fellow prisoners, aware of the repercussions, became more cautious, often distancing themselves from those implicated in escape attempts. The social consequences could be isolating. Alliances that once offered protection or support might dissolve under suspicion or fear. Failed escapees learned quickly that trust, once broken or questioned, could be difficult to rebuild. Interestingly, the response to failure varied depending on status. VIP prisoners, nobles, scholars, and poets might receive somewhat milder treatment, partly because of their connections outside the prison walls. Even so, they were not immune to punishment, and any leniency was often calculated to maintain authority rather than reflect compassion. Ordinary inmates, particularly debtors or political prisoners, bore the brunt of punitive measures. For them, failure often meant a return to the same overcrowded cells, with the added burden of physical pain, psychological strain, and diminished hope. These failures reinforced an important lesson. Survival depended as much on patience, discretion, and adaptation as on daring. Attempting escape without careful planning or support was often tantamount to inviting additional suffering. Observant prisoners learned from these episodes, noting guard patterns, structural weaknesses, and the pitfalls of impulsivity. In some cases, the mere story of a failed escape, shared through whispers or written notes, provided guidance to others, shaping behavior, alliances, and social strategies within the prison. The emotional toll was considerable. Repeated failure eroded morale, fostering despair, anxiety, and sometimes resignation. Yet it also demonstrated the resilience of the human spirit. Even in the face of strict confinement, prisoners continued to imagine freedom, strategize quietly, or plan incremental acts of agency. These small exercises in creativity and hope, though seldom resulting in literal liberation, sustained the mental and emotional well-being of inmates. Failure also underscored the dangers of isolation. Inmates who acted alone were most vulnerable, emphasizing the importance of alliances, observation, and negotiation. Cooperative strategies, sharing knowledge, creating diversions, or pooling resources could mitigate risk, though never eliminate it entirely. The tension between personal ambition and collective safety shaped daily life, reinforcing that survival required both caution and ingenuity. Finally, understanding failed escapes illuminates the broader rhythms of prison life. It demonstrates that confinement was not merely a static, passive experience. It was a dynamic environment shaped by hope, ingenuity, risk, and consequence. For prisoners, each failed attempt was a reminder of limits, a test of resilience, and an opportunity to learn. In this sense, failure became a form of education, a harsh but instructive guide for navigating the intricate world of Caliphate prisons. The next chapter naturally turns to disasters that were often entirely accidental: fires, floods, and structural collapses. Unlike escape, these dangers were external and uncontrollable, yet no less destructive, reminding prisoners that survival required vigilance, adaptability, and an enduring spirit. Even without daring escape attempts or political intrigue, Caliphate prisons were not safe havens. Beyond human cruelty, the environment itself posed serious dangers. Fires, floods, structural failures, and other accidental disasters were persistent threats. For prisoners already living in cramped, overcrowded, and unsanitary conditions, such events could be catastrophic, adding another layer of fear to daily life. Understanding these hazards underscores how survival required constant vigilance, improvisation, and the ability to endure both human and natural adversity. Fires were among the most common and devastating accidents. Many prisons relied on lamps, torches, or small stoves for light and warmth. A stray ember, an overturned lamp, or careless handling of flammable materials could ignite a conflagration. With overcrowded cells, narrow corridors, and limited exits, a small fire could spread rapidly. Panic often worsened the situation. Prisoners rushed to escape, sometimes trampling one another or getting caught in collapsing ceilings or walls. The psychological impact of these events could linger for weeks, instilling a lasting fear of fire and the constant need to be alert. Flooding was another hazard, particularly in prisons located near rivers or in regions with heavy seasonal rains. Poor drainage systems and overcrowded rooms meant that even minor flooding could ruin bedding, destroy personal belongings, and spread disease. Waterlogged cells were cold and unsanitary, increasing the risk of illness. Prisoners often had to improvise, raising mats above wet floors, creating makeshift drainage channels, or helping each other reach dry areas. Cooperation and ingenuity became crucial, demonstrating again that survival depended as much on social networks as on physical resilience. Structural failures, collapsing walls, ceilings, or poorly constructed cells added yet another layer of danger. Many prisons were repurposed buildings, hastily reinforced to hold more prisoners than intended. Cracks in walls, weakened beams, or overloaded floors could give way without warning. Such incidents caused injuries or fatalities, sometimes on a massive scale. Prisoners quickly learned to identify the most precarious areas, avoid certain rooms during storms, and alert others to potential hazards. Again, knowledge, observation, and social cooperation became tools of survival. These environmental disasters were unpredictable. Unlike punishments, which followed rules or routines, fires, floods, and collapses struck without warning. Prisoners had to remain constantly alert, mentally calculating risks, adapting to changing conditions, and sometimes acting collectively to minimize harm. Even small gestures, helping a fellow prisoner carry belongings, alerting guards, or clearing debris, could mean the difference between life and death. In a space already defined by confinement, these hazards reinforced the fragility of human existence and the importance of social bonds. The psychological impact of environmental dangers was significant. Anxiety, hypervigilance, and stress compounded the already difficult realities of hunger, disease, and overcrowding. Yet, as with failed escapes or social tensions, prisoners found ways to cope. Humor, ingenuity, shared vigilance, and mutual aid became tools for preserving sanity. Over time, prisoners developed routines for responding to emergencies, rotating watch schedules, improvised signaling systems, and careful placement of belongings became part of daily life, blending necessity with strategy. These disasters highlight an important truth. Caliphate prisons were environments in which survival required continuous adaptation. Human cruelty, institutional neglect, and natural hazards combined to create spaces that were unpredictable, dangerous, and psychologically taxing. Yet prisoners demonstrated remarkable resilience, relying on observation, cooperation, and ingenuity to endure. From here, the next chapter naturally transitions to the internal struggles of the mind, boredom, despair, and the endless waiting that weighed heavily on prisoners. Unlike fires or floods, these challenges were invisible yet persistent, shaping life behind bars in equally profound ways. Beyond hunger, disease, and overcrowding, one of the most pervasive burdens of prison life was the invisible weight of time itself. Days stretched into weeks, weeks into months, and months into years, with little sense of progression or certainty. The mental strain of endless waiting, uncertain release, delayed justice, or unpredictable punishment was a subtle yet relentless form of suffering. For prisoners in Caliphate prisons, survival depended not only on physical resilience, but on mastering the mind's response to monotony, despair, and uncertainty. Boredom was an ever-present companion. Overcrowded cells often lacked meaningful activity, and even those with access to books, writing materials, or limited labor faced long stretches of repetitive idleness. Time seemed to slow, each hour marked by the small rituals of daily survival: the arrival of food, the opening of a door, or the sound of a guard's footsteps. Without intellectual or social stimulation, many prisoners reported mental fatigue, irritability, and a creeping sense of futility. In this environment, even minor distractions, conversation, storytelling, or quiet reflection, became precious tools for maintaining mental equilibrium. Anxiety compounded the burden of waiting. Prisoners never knew when inspections, punishments, or transfers might occur. Political prisoners, religious offenders, and those with family outside the walls felt heightened tension as outcomes were uncertain and consequences potentially severe. This uncertainty extended to health, safety, and survival. Prisoners feared disease outbreaks, fires, or attacks from fellow inmates. The constant anticipation of unknown events created a mental state in which vigilance was mandatory yet exhausting. Sleep could be fitful, attention strained, and emotional stability continuously challenged. Prisoners developed strategies to cope with these challenges. Routine was one of the most effective tools. Structured schedules for prayer, meals, writing, or study provided a sense of control in an otherwise unpredictable environment. Social interaction, though sometimes risky, offered connection, distraction, and emotional relief. Some prisoners used storytelling or recitation of poetry to pass the hours and preserve cultural memory, while others focused on intellectual pursuits, philosophical reflection, or meticulous observation of prison dynamics. These strategies transformed idle time into purposeful activity, helping to maintain sanity and self-worth. Religion and spiritual practice played an equally important role. Daily prayers, meditation, and devotional reading provided rhythm, comfort, and perspective. For many, these practices offered a framework for understanding suffering, instilling patience, and reinforcing a sense of dignity. Spiritual reflection became both a psychological lifeline and a tool for moral resilience, allowing prisoners to endure hardship with a degree of internal order and hope. The weight of waiting also shaped social dynamics. Friendships, rivalries, and alliances were intensified by prolonged confinement. Inmates observed each other carefully, relying on subtle cues to predict behavior, avoid conflict, or identify potential allies. Trust was precious and fragile. Long-term relationships could ease the mental burden, while betrayal or tension amplified anxiety. Survival was as much about navigating these social networks as it was about food, shelter, or physical health. Endless waiting also fostered creativity and ingenuity. Prisoners found ways to count days, mark time, and occupy the mind through games, patterns, or small rituals. Even in extreme monotony, imagination became a form of freedom, a mental space untouched by the walls, the guards, and the scarcity surrounding them. This mental resilience was essential, enabling prisoners to endure years of confinement with a measure of dignity and self-preservation intact. Understanding the mental weight of waiting illuminates the profound psychological challenges of imprisonment. Physical hardship was only one part of the equation. Enduring uncertainty, monotony, and fear required as much skill, patience, and ingenuity as any escape attempt or negotiation with authorities. Mastering these internal struggles prepared prisoners for the delicate navigation of relationships and survival strategies beyond the cell walls. From here, the next chapter naturally turns to the people waiting outside, the families who endured their own anxieties, financial strain, and social scrutiny, acting as invisible pillars of support for those behind bars. Prison walls separated inmates from the outside world, but those walls did not confine the anguish, labor, and worry of the families left behind. Relatives of prisoners, parents, spouses, siblings, and children often became, in effect, secondary prisoners themselves. Their lives were shaped by absence, uncertainty, and the constant need to provide support, negotiate conditions, or advocate for mercy. Understanding these families illuminates the broader social ecosystem surrounding Caliphate prisons and reveals that imprisonment's effects rippled far beyond the cells. One of the most immediate burdens was financial. Families frequently had to supply food, bedding, and clothing, or bribe officials to improve conditions. In the absence of a regular income from the imprisoned relative, households often faced hardship. A spouse or parent might take on extra labor, negotiate loans, or appeal to local patrons or charitable institutions. Even modest support required ingenuity, arranging visits, transporting provisions, and delivering messages demanded coordination, timing, and the ability to navigate bureaucratic systems. Mistakes could mean confiscated goods or retaliation against the prisoner. Emotional strain was equally significant. Families lived with constant uncertainty, unsure of when or if the prisoner would be released. Letters might arrive sporadically, if at all, and news of mistreatment could provoke intense anxiety. Worry was compounded by isolation. Neighbors and community members often speculated about the circumstances, adding social pressure and shame. Families had to maintain morale not only for themselves, but for the imprisoned individual, balancing their own grief with the need to provide reassurance and hope. Advocacy was a crucial form of labor. Families petitioned wardens, clerics, and local authorities for better treatment or early release. They sometimes engaged intermediaries, offering gifts, performing services, or appealing to religious or civic obligation. This work required diplomacy, persistence, and social acumen. Families became experts in reading the moods of officials, leveraging influence where possible, and managing delicate interactions to protect their loved one. Their success or failure could directly affect the prisoner's daily life, from diet to cell assignment to exposure to harsher punishment. Social networks also mattered. Extended families, friends, and charitable communities could provide assistance, pooling resources, or advocating collectively. Mutual aid helped offset the isolation and vulnerability of individual households. In some cases, religious institutions or local patrons became crucial allies, offering food, funds, or letters of support. These networks reinforced the interconnectedness of society and the idea that imprisonment was not a purely private affair. It was an event that shaped entire communities. Psychologically, families had to navigate a strange duality, hope and despair coexisting in near constant tension. Each favorable report or small improvement sparked relief and optimism, while setbacks, illness, or news of punishment brought renewed fear. Children often bore this tension in quiet ways, learning resilience early. Parents and spouses cultivated patience, creativity, and careful negotiation, balancing care for themselves and the prisoner with practical survival. The role of families underscores an essential truth. Imprisonment extended far beyond the cell walls. Prisoners were not isolated actors. They were embedded in networks of obligation, love, and dependence. A prisoner's survival often hinged on the efforts of those outside, just as the well-being of families depended on their capacity to navigate the logistical, emotional, and social challenges imposed by incarceration. In effect, the hardships of imprisonment were shared, creating a parallel struggle that was no less demanding than the one experienced inside. These family dynamics naturally lead into the next chapter, which focuses on women who were imprisoned, often facing additional layers of vulnerability, societal scrutiny, and unique challenges. Understanding women prisoners provides insight into how gender-shaped experiences of confinement and how families both supported and were affected by these conditions. Prison life in the Caliphates was overwhelmingly dominated by men, but women were not exempt from confinement. Their experiences were shaped by gender, social status, and the often rigid expectations of society. Women prisoners faced unique challenges, both physical and psychological, which made survival particularly precarious. Understanding their circumstances illuminates not only the conditions inside prisons, but also the broader social and cultural pressures that affected women in Islamic societies. Many women were imprisoned for reasons similar to men: debt, political affiliation, or accusations of religious transgression. Others were confined because of familial connections or disputes that had escalated into legal cases. In some instances, women were jailed to exert pressure on male relatives, husbands, fathers, or brothers, creating a secondary form of leverage within families. Regardless of the reason, confinement disrupted lives, imposed dependency, and magnified vulnerability. Physical conditions for women were often harsh. Female prisoners were usually housed separately from men, but these accommodations were rarely better. Cells were cramped, poorly ventilated, and lacked privacy. Sanitation was a persistent issue, particularly during menstruation or pregnancy. Food was often insufficient, and women had fewer opportunities to supplement their diets through family support, visits, or charity. Illnesses spread quickly, and medical assistance was minimal, leaving women to rely on herbal remedies, advice from peers, or sheer endurance. Social dynamics within women's sections mirrored those in men's prisons, but with distinct nuances. Hierarchies often emerged based on age, marital status, or connections to influential families. Older women, or those with prior experience in the legal or religious system, sometimes assumed leadership, mediating disputes or guiding younger inmates. Alliances were crucial for protection, sharing resources, and maintaining emotional well-being. Yet conflicts could arise over limited supplies, favoritism from guards, or competition for outside assistance. Navigating these relationships required tact, diplomacy, and resilience. Family connections played an especially vital role for women. Husbands, fathers, or adult children often acted as lifelines, providing food, clothing, and financial support. In some cases, charitable networks, local religious authorities, or sympathetic neighbors supplemented these efforts. For women whose families lacked influence, support networks inside the prison, friendships, mentorships, or alliances became essential for survival. Mutual aid helped mitigate both physical and psychological hardship, demonstrating the importance of social cohesion, even in restrictive environments. The psychological toll of imprisonment on women was profound. Beyond the universal stresses of confinement, boredom, uncertainty, fear, women contended with social stigma, disrupted family roles, and isolation from children or spouses. Pregnant women faced additional anxieties, balancing health concerns with limited resources. Mothers who were separated from their children endured particularly acute emotional distress. Writing, prayer, and whispered conversation provided outlets for coping, but the mental burden remained constant, requiring remarkable resilience and ingenuity. Some women found ways to assert agency and protect themselves. They used storytelling, teaching, or religious instruction to maintain authority within their peer group. Others negotiated with guards or officials, using family connections or strategic appeals to improve conditions. In extreme cases, women engaged in acts of defiance, subtle resistance, or even planning escape. These actions required courage, cleverness, and careful judgment, balancing survival with personal dignity. The experiences of women prisoners highlight the intersection of gender, power, and vulnerability. While sharing many hardships with male inmates, women faced additional societal pressures and practical challenges. Their strategies for coping, through alliances, faith, and ingenuity, underscore both the harshness of confinement and the resilience of the human spirit. From here, the next chapter naturally turns to children who ended up in prison, often as dependents of adults or caught in circumstances beyond their control, adding yet another layer of complexity and tragedy to the life behind bars. While most prisoners were adults, children occasionally found themselves behind bars, not always by choice. These young inmates were often caught in circumstances beyond their control, accompanying a parent, inheriting a parent's debt, or becoming collateral in political disputes. Their presence in Caliphate prisons added a unique dimension to the daily experience, blending vulnerability, dependence, and tragedy with the harsh realities of confinement. Understanding the situation of children illuminates both the human cost of incarceration and the adaptive strategies families and prison communities employed to protect the youngest among them. Many children ended up in prison as dependents. Sons or daughters of debtors, for example, might remain with parents because no alternative care was available. Political prisoners' families were sometimes detained to exert leverage or punish the adult prisoner indirectly. In other instances, orphaned or abandoned children might be placed in custody, where they were subject to the same physical hardships and social hierarchies as adult inmates. Their confinement was rarely temporary, as the administrative processes governing release or guardianship were slow, complex, and inconsistent. The physical conditions for children were particularly challenging. Overcrowding, poor sanitation, and insufficient food affected them disproportionately. Even minor illnesses could become dangerous without proper care. Infants, toddlers, and young children often relied entirely on older family members or fellow prisoners for sustenance, hygiene, and comfort. Makeshift arrangements, shared bedding, improvised cradles, or pooled resources were common. Despite these efforts, vulnerability remained high, and many children experienced malnutrition, disease, or psychological trauma. Social dynamics within the prison shaped the experiences of children as well. Older siblings or peers often assumed protective roles, mediating disputes, securing food, and offering emotional reassurance. Some children learned early how to navigate hierarchies and alliances, observing adult interactions to understand rules, avoid conflict, and assert limited agency. In this sense, children grew up in a microcosm of society, learning resilience, strategy, and adaptability under extreme conditions. Education and play, while limited, offered important relief. For some, writing, reading, or religious instruction provided mental stimulation and a sense of routine. Simple games, storytelling, and shared laughter offered brief moments of joy and distraction, helping children maintain a sense of identity and imagination amid deprivation. These activities, though modest, were critical for psychological survival, offering both comfort and a foundation for coping with prolonged confinement. The emotional toll on children and their families was profound. Parents and caregivers faced the dual challenge of protecting their own lives while safeguarding the well-being of their children. Anxiety, fear, and guilt were constant companions, and families often made difficult choices to ensure safety, even when options were limited. In some cases, older children assumed adult responsibilities, helping to care for younger siblings and easing the burden on parents. These dynamics created a fragile ecosystem of care and survival within the prison. Children's experiences also highlighted the intersection of social, legal, and moral considerations in Caliphate prisons. Incarceration was not solely punitive. It reflected broader societal structures, including debt enforcement, political, strategy, and communal responsibility. How children fared depended on a combination of family support, alliances, charitable intervention, and sheer luck. These young lives reveal that imprisonment extended far beyond the individual offender, shaping generations and leaving lasting psychological and social effects. Understanding children in prison prepares the way for the next chapter. Debtors, the most common and often most tragic category of prisoners. Like children, their experiences reveal the intersection of economic systems, social networks, and human resilience in the harsh environment of incarceration. In the vast network of Caliphate prisons, the largest single group of prisoners were those confined for debt. Unlike political prisoners or religious offenders, debtors were not dangerous ideologues or heretics. They were ordinary people trapped by financial circumstances. Yet their experiences were often among the harshest, combining physical deprivation, social stigma, and uncertainty. Understanding their plight reveals both the economic structures of the time and the human cost of financial failure. Debtors arrived for many reasons: unpaid taxes, failed business ventures, loans from merchants or moneylenders, or fines imposed by the state. Even small sums could result in imprisonment, especially when enforcement was strict and creditors powerful. Unlike other crimes, which might have legal defenses, debt was largely inescapable. The debtor's body became collateral for what they owed, and the only path to freedom was repayment or intervention by sympathetic parties. Life for debtors was often grimly monotonous. Cells were overcrowded, poorly ventilated, and lacking in basic sanitation. Food was minimal, sometimes rationed or irregular, and water could be scarce or contaminated. debtors relied heavily on family support, charitable donations, or their own ingenuity to survive. Sleeping arrangements were communal, often with mats or straw shared among several prisoners. In these conditions, illness spread quickly, and even minor injuries or fevers could become serious without medical attention. Social hierarchies among debtors reflected both economic and personal factors. Wealthier inmates who could bribe guards or secure extra provisions often dominated informal networks, while those without means depended on alliances for protection and survival. Older or more experienced debtors sometimes acted as mentors, teaching younger inmates how to navigate the daily challenges of confinement, from negotiating with wardens to securing extra food. Yet rivalries and tension were constant, fueled by scarcity and frustration. The psychological burden of debt imprisonment was immense. Shame, despair, and fear accompanied physical discomfort. Many debtors were fathers, husbands, or heads of households, and their incarceration disrupted families and livelihoods. Letters from home were treasured, but delays or absences could exacerbate anxiety. Time was measured in small increments: meals, inspections, or the occasional visit, reinforcing the monotony and mental strain. Coping required patience, ingenuity, and careful emotional management. Some debtors attempted to alleviate their situation through negotiation or bribes. Payments to guards or mediators could secure better sleeping arrangements, extra food, or even partial release. In other cases, community, charity, or religious institutions intervened, helping to settle debts and free prisoners. These interventions were rare and unpredictable, highlighting how survival often depended on external factors beyond the debtor's control. Despite the misery, debtors developed strategies for endurance. Social cooperation, sharing food, helping the sick, or organizing daily routines helped mitigate the harshness of confinement. Mental activities such as reading, storytelling, or religious reflection provided distraction and psychological stability. These acts of resilience demonstrate that even in seemingly hopeless circumstances, prisoners exercised agency and preserved dignity. The prominence of debtors in Caliphate prisons also reveals broader societal structures. Their confinement reflected not only economic enforcement, but also the intersection of law, social hierarchy, and morality. It highlighted the precariousness of life in a system where failure to meet obligations could mean loss of freedom. And it underscored how survival relied on both personal ingenuity and the networks of support extending beyond the prison walls. This chapter naturally leads into the next: hostages and ransom, a related form of human captivity, where imprisonment was tied to negotiation, diplomacy, and political leverage rather than personal failings. It demonstrates how imprisonment, in various forms, was both a personal and societal mechanism of control. In the Caliphates, not all prisoners were confined for crimes or debts. Some were detained as hostages, held as leverage in political negotiations, or as part of broader strategies of diplomacy and coercion. Unlike debtors or common criminals, these individuals were pawns in larger games of power, often caught in situations far beyond their personal control. Their experiences illuminate a unique form of imprisonment, one where survival depended not only on endurance and resourcefulness, but on the fluctuations of fortune, negotiation, and influence. Hostages were often members of elite families, political rivals, or representatives of neighboring states. Their captivity served as insurance, compliance with treaties, payment of tribute, or adherence to agreements could be secured by the presence of someone valuable behind bars. In some cases, the hostage's social or political significance determined the conditions of confinement. Well-connected prisoners might enjoy relative comfort, private cells, or allowances of food and books, while still being denied freedom. Others, less fortunate, faced harsh conditions, used as a warning to their families or communities. Ransom was closely linked to hostage-taking. Families, allies, or states were expected to provide payment or concessions to secure release. The amount demanded could be substantial, sometimes equivalent to a fortune, reflecting both the hostage's perceived value and the political context. Negotiations were delicate and often prolonged, dependent on local intermediaries, clerics, or bureaucrats. The prisoner's welfare frequently hinged on the skill, persistence, and resources of those advocating on their behalf. Mistakes, delays, or miscommunication could exacerbate suffering, making captivity both an economic and emotional burden. Conditions for hostages varied widely. Some were granted privileges designed to maintain health and morale, ensuring they remained physically capable to fulfill their political function. Others faced confinement similar to ordinary prisoners, with limited food, overcrowded quarters, and constant monitoring. Social interaction depended on the number and type of prisoners held together. Hostages might form alliances with fellow captives, strategize to improve their circumstances, or rely on sympathetic guards. Observation and adaptability were critical. Understanding the priorities and moods of captors could directly influence daily life and ultimately the chance of release. The psychological toll of being a hostage was significant. Unlike debtors or criminals, hostages often had a clear reason for their confinement. Yet this did not diminish uncertainty. They had to endure the anxiety of negotiation, the stress of delayed ransom, and the awareness that their fate was tied entirely to external decisions. Maintaining composure, patience, and the ability to engage diplomatically with captors were essential survival skills. In some cases, hostages cultivated learning, study, or correspondence to preserve identity, assert agency, or keep morale intact. Social dynamics among hostages also mattered. Bonds could form across political, familial, or regional lines, providing companionship, protection, and shared strategies for coping. Conflicts were equally possible, particularly when resources were scarce or personal ambitions clashed. As with other forms of imprisonment, alliances and careful negotiation within the prison were as important as external advocacy. The practice of holding hostages and negotiating ransom underscores the intersection of power, economy, and human lives. Prisoners were rarely anonymous. Their identity, connections, and perceived value shaped every aspect of confinement. Survival required a combination of resilience, strategy, social intelligence, and patience, revealing that imprisonment could be both a tool of coercion and a test of adaptability. Understanding the dynamics of hostages and ransom naturally leads to the next chapter, war captives, whose imprisonment was tied to broader conflicts and mass detention, offering a different lens on the relationship between confinement, labor, and survival in Caliphate society. In the Caliphates, wars were not merely fought on battlefields. They extended into prisons, where captured soldiers, civilians, and entire communities could become a population of prisoners. Unlike individual debtors or political hostages, war captives were often mass prisoners, caught in a collective system of containment, labor, and negotiation. Their experiences illuminate a different aspect of imprisonment, where survival depended not only on personal resilience, but on cooperation, adaptability, and sheer endurance in the face of overwhelming numbers. Captured soldiers often faced immediate physical hardship. After defeat, they might be restrained, marched long distances to prison sites, or confined in temporary holding areas before being assigned to more permanent facilities. Conditions were generally harsh. Overcrowding, poor sanitation, and limited access to food or water were common. Illness and injury were rampant, exacerbated by malnutrition and fatigue. Survival required careful navigation of both physical risks and social hierarchies within these mass populations. War captives were also frequently put to work. Labor assignments ranged from construction and maintenance to agricultural tasks, often serving the needs of the captor's state or local economy. Work was grueling, and compliance was not optional. Captives who resisted or faltered could face punishment, while those who demonstrated skill, diligence, or cooperation might gain slightly better treatment. In this way, labor became both a necessity for survival and a potential avenue for improved conditions, highlighting the transactional nature of captivity. Social dynamics among captives were complex. Soldiers accustomed to hierarchy and command structures often had to adapt to life among strangers, forming new alliances or informal chains of authority. Older, experienced captives sometimes assumed leadership roles, organizing groups, mediating disputes, and distributing scarce resources. Trust was essential, yet fragile, as betrayal or conflict could threaten safety or provoke punishment. Children, women, or other vulnerable populations among captives required additional care, often relying on protective networks to survive. The psychological impact of mass captivity was profound. Unlike solitary prisoners, war captives were constantly aware of the collective suffering around them. Noise, overcrowding, and the sight of illness or injury contributed to chronic stress. Uncertainty loomed large. Release, ransom, or exchange might be months or years away, and captives had little control over outcomes. Maintaining morale required imagination, patience, and social cohesion. Storytelling, religious practice, and small rituals became vital tools for coping, providing both structure and a sense of agency in a chaotic environment. Negotiation and diplomacy played a critical role in the fate of war captives. States, commanders, or influential intermediaries could secure release through ransom, prisoner exchanges, or political agreements. Captives' survival often depended as much on external advocacy and timing as on their endurance inside prison walls. Knowledge of these processes was crucial. Captives had to understand not only daily routines, but the broader political landscape shaping their captivity. The treatment of war captives also varied according to status. Officers, nobles, or individuals of strategic importance often received better accommodations, while ordinary soldiers or civilians faced harsher conditions. This disparity reinforced social hierarchies even in captivity, reminding all prisoners that survival depended not only on compliance and resilience but also on perceived value. Understanding war captivity highlights the intersection of military conflict, social organization, and human endurance. Captivity was both collective and individual, physical and psychological, requiring prisoners to adapt constantly to a challenging environment. Survival demanded cooperation, observation, and ingenuity, revealing the complex interplay of power, labor, and human resilience in Caliphate prisons. From here, the next chapter naturally focuses on notable prisoners whose stories have survived, offering vivid examples of endurance, ingenuity, and suffering under confinement. These personal narratives illuminate broader trends while highlighting the human dimension of incarceration. While most prisoners in the caliphates were ordinary individuals, debtors, war captives, or religious offenders, history also remembers those whose names carried weight, influence, or notoriety. Scholars, poets, nobles, and political rivals sometimes found themselves confined, often enduring the same misery as the average inmate, albeit with occasional privileges. Their stories provide vivid glimpses into prison life, highlighting both universal hardships and unique experiences shaped by status, intellect, or reputation. One common thread among famous prisoners was the constant tension between visibility and vulnerability. Their fame often meant that captors monitored them more closely, aware of the potential for influence, agitation, or public outrage. Letters, books, and correspondence were restricted. Visitors were scrutinized. Yet fame could also afford certain protections: private cells, better food, or the occasional leniency in daily routine. These privileges were never guaranteed, however, and the psychological strain of dependency on capricious authority remained significant. Scholars and poets often coped by turning inward, using writing as both refuge and resistance. Diaries, treatises, and poems provided mental escape, allowing prisoners to maintain intellectual agency despite confinement. For example, scholars might compose commentaries on philosophical or religious texts, sometimes smuggling writings to students or peers outside. Poets crafted verses reflecting suffering, hope, and observation, offering a voice to those silenced by walls and chains. In these ways, intellect and creativity became tools of endurance, enabling prisoners to assert identity and preserve dignity. Political rivals, nobles, and former officials faced a different type of challenge, negotiating survival within a system designed to strip them of influence. Isolation, surveillance, and public shaming were common tactics. Some used their status to negotiate, petition, or bribe officials, seeking favorable treatment or early release. Others endured humiliation with stoicism, relying on mental discipline and reputation to navigate interactions with guards, fellow inmates, and intermediaries. Even minor mistakes, an unguarded remark, a missed opportunity to comply, could result in severe consequences. The physical hardships were, in many ways, universal. Overcrowding, poor sanitation, irregular meals, and exposure to disease affected both famous and ordinary prisoners. The difference lay often in the ability to mitigate these hardships through wealth, family connections, or social capital. Yet no amount of status fully insulated prisoners from the unpredictability of the environment. Fires, floods, illness, and punishment remained constant threats, reminding all inmates that survival required vigilance, adaptability, and endurance. Stories of famous prisoners also illustrate the importance of social networks within prison walls. Alliances, mentorships, and friendships often shaped experiences as much as privilege or status. A well-connected prisoner could serve as a protector, mediator, or source of information, while rivalries could exacerbate misery. These dynamics highlight that confinement was not merely a physical state, but a complex social ecosystem in which intellect, influence, and strategy could mean the difference between relative comfort and intense suffering. Despite fame, many prisoners hated every minute of it. The psychological toll of uncertainty, loss of autonomy, and forced inactivity was immense. Letters from loved ones, access to books, or fleeting privileges provided only temporary relief. For some, the passage of time was measured in small, repetitive rituals, reflection, and the hope of release. These personal accounts illuminate the human dimension of imprisonment: fear, frustration, resilience, and the relentless quest for agency within oppressive systems. The experiences of notable prisoners provide context for understanding broader attempts at prison reform. Their status often brought attention to conditions, inspired petitions, or motivated legislative experiments. Yet even these interventions were frequently limited, inconsistent, or counterproductive, highlighting the enduring challenges of improving institutional practices within Caliphate prisons. The next chapter naturally turns to such reform efforts, examining attempts to regulate, improve, or humanize prisons, and why these well-intentioned interventions often fell short, despite the visibility and advocacy of notable inmates. Efforts to reform Caliphate prisons were rare, but not non-existent. Over the centuries, rulers, clerics, and officials occasionally recognized that the conditions of confinement were harsh, inconsistent, and sometimes counterproductive. These attempts at improvement, though often well-intentioned, were frequently undermined by bureaucratic inefficiency, lack of resources, or entrenched corruption. Understanding these reform efforts provides insight into the challenges of institutional change and the persistent difficulties faced by prisoners in their daily lives. One approach to reform involved standardizing prison management. Some rulers issued decrees specifying rules for diet, punishment, and labor. They sought to reduce cruelty, prevent overcrowding, and establish clearer administrative procedures. In theory, this would create a more predictable and humane environment, allowing prisoners to endure confinement with dignity. In practice, these reforms often faltered. Wardens and prison officials were poorly paid, overworked, or indifferent, and enforcement of new regulations was inconsistent at best. Promises of better conditions often remained unfulfilled, leaving prisoners to navigate the same hardships with little improvement. Another common reform strategy focused on the treatment of specific categories of prisoners: debt prisoners, VIPs, political captives, and war prisoners were sometimes granted privileges, such as separate accommodations, allowances for family visits, or the right to study or work under supervision. These measures were intended to address particular vulnerabilities, but they often created tensions. Ordinary inmates saw inequities as favoritism, and the resulting jealousy or resentment could exacerbate social conflict within prisons. Moreover, selective reform left the majority of prisoners, particularly debtors and the poor, still subject to the harshest conditions. Religious and charitable initiatives occasionally supplemented official reform. Clerics, scholars, and philanthropic organizations sought to provide food, blankets, or medical assistance, aiming to alleviate suffering. Such interventions had a tangible impact on daily life, offering hope and relief. Yet these efforts depended heavily on resources, connections, and the goodwill of intermediaries. They could not address systemic problems like overcrowding, disease, or inadequate staffing. Charitable acts, while compassionate, were a bandage rather than a solution. Administrative reforms often faced resistance from within. Wardens, guards, and local officials had incentives to maintain the status quo. Bribes, favoritism, and informal hierarchies provided personal gain and influence, which threatened to undermine any new rules. Attempted reforms also relied on accurate reporting and oversight, which were often incomplete or ignored. Even when decrees were issued from the highest levels of government, enforcement at the local level proved inconsistent. As a result, prisoners experienced little change, and the cycle of hardship continued. Despite these failures, reform efforts were not entirely without merit. They highlighted recognition, however limited, that prisons were integral to governance and that inhumane conditions could undermine both justice and social stability. They also inspired temporary improvements, occasional relief for the sick, modest expansion of facilities, or greater attention to legal procedures. In some cases, these reforms set precedents for future generations, demonstrating that incremental change was possible, even if rarely realized fully. Psychologically, attempted reforms had mixed effects on prisoners. Awareness that authorities recognized suffering could offer hope, yet inconsistent implementation often deepened frustration. Prisoners became accustomed to promises that were unfulfilled, learning to rely on ingenuity, social networks, and resilience rather than official intervention. These experiences reinforced a fundamental lesson. Survival depended not on systemic benevolence, but on adaptability, patience, and strategic action within the prison community. In the end, attempts at prison reform often fell short, leaving the underlying hardships of Caliphate prisons largely intact. Hunger, overcrowding, disease, corruption, and social tension persisted, and the daily struggle for survival remained unchanged for the majority of inmates. Yet these efforts provide insight into the aspirations, challenges, and occasional glimpses of humanity that punctuated a system designed to confine, punish, and control. The next chapter naturally turns to release and its aftermath, examining how freedom, though eagerly sought, often brought new challenges and revealed that life outside the prison walls was far from simple or seamless. Release from a caliphate prison was a moment of relief, joy, and possibility, but it rarely meant an immediate return to normal life. Freedom was often partial, precarious, and fraught with new challenges. Former prisoners faced lingering physical, emotional, and social consequences of their confinement, navigating a world that had moved on without them. Understanding this phase of life illuminates the enduring impact of incarceration and the complex process of reintegration. For many, physical recovery was the first hurdle. Years of malnutrition, disease, overcrowding, and labor had weakened bodies. Some released prisoners required weeks or months to regain basic strength, while chronic illnesses or injuries could persist indefinitely. Scarce medical resources outside the prison often complicated recovery, and some former inmates relied on family, friends, or charitable networks to provide care, food, and shelter. Even those with social connections faced the challenge of reestablishing their health in an environment less predictable than the structured, if harsh, routines of confinement. The psychological impact of imprisonment lingered as well. Boredom, fear, anxiety, and uncertainty had shaped daily life behind bars, and these habits could persist after release. Some ex-prisoners experienced lingering trauma, nightmares, hypervigilance, or difficulty trusting others. Reintegration required adaptation to social norms, legal obligations, and the emotional landscape of family and community. In some cases, the stigma of incarceration, whether for debt, political dissent, or religious offense, added additional layers of complexity, affecting marriage prospects, business opportunities, or social standing. Economic reintegration was often difficult. Debtors, one of the largest prisoner groups, frequently returned to the same financial pressures that had landed them behind bars. They faced demands from creditors, loss of property, or ruined reputations, making the path to stability slow and uncertain. Even formerly wealthy or politically connected prisoners had to rebuild influence, regain trust, and navigate systems that may have shifted in their absence. Some found employment through family or community networks, while others relied on trade, craftsmanship, or charity to survive. Social reintegration required rebuilding relationships fractured or strained by imprisonment. Families often bore the emotional and financial burden of confinement, and reconciliation could be delicate. Friends, neighbors, and allies might have moved on, changed loyalties, or forgotten obligations. For political or religious prisoners, returning to public life could involve careful negotiation to avoid renewed scrutiny or retaliation. In this sense, freedom was both a relief and a negotiation. Every action required awareness of the past and prudence for the future. Despite these challenges, release also offered opportunity. Former prisoners could reconnect with loved ones, resume spiritual practice, and engage in work or study. Intellectual and creative pursuits, cultivated during imprisonment, sometimes flourished once more in freedom. Scholars, poets, and thinkers drew on their experiences behind bars to produce writing that preserved historical insight, expressed personal reflection, or contributed to broader societal discourse. Even ordinary inmates found small avenues for agency, leveraging skills, resilience, and social networks honed during confinement. The phrase, never really free, reflects more than lingering hardship. It captures the long shadow of imprisonment. Memories of confinement, social consequences, economic struggles, and health challenges all shaped life after release. Former prisoners often had to negotiate authority, maintain vigilance, and adapt skills developed under duress to navigate a society that had continued to evolve while they were confined. Freedom, therefore, was a process rather than a single event, a gradual, ongoing effort to reclaim autonomy, dignity, and stability. These experiences naturally lead to the final chapter, which reflects on the broader legacy of prisoners' lives. Though often forgotten in historical records, their endurance, adaptability, and influence shaped society indirectly, leaving subtle imprints on law, culture, and memory that extend long after physical confinement ended. Prisoners of the Caliphates are rarely celebrated in history books. They appear as footnotes, occasional anecdotes, or background figures in tales of political intrigue, warfare, or governance. Yet their lives, often confined, overlooked, and constrained, left subtle but enduring traces on society. Understanding their legacy requires looking beyond the walls, recognizing the ways ordinary endurance, intellectual pursuit, and social resilience shaped culture, law, and human memory. Though forgotten, their experiences continue to inform the present, offering lessons in resilience, adaptation, and the human capacity to endure hardship. One of the most immediate legacies is social. Prisoners maintained networks of kin, friends, and allies, both inside and outside prison walls. These networks preserved family structures, supported the vulnerable, and enabled communities to adapt to adversity. For women, children, and families of debtors or political prisoners, these networks became critical lifelines, creating informal systems of care and mutual aid that persisted beyond individual incarceration. The efforts of these communities shaped social cohesion, demonstrating that resilience often depended as much on collective action as on individual strength. Intellect and creativity also endured. Scholars, poets, and thinkers confined for political or religious reasons produced works that have survived to inform modern understanding of culture, philosophy, and history. Diaries, letters, treatises, and poetry captured the lived realities of confinement, providing rare insight into the daily struggles, fears, and reflections of prisoners. Their writings reveal not only personal endurance, but also a form of resistance, an assertion of identity and agency despite physical constraint. These contributions to literature and scholarship became part of the broader intellectual heritage, influencing subsequent generations of thinkers and artists. Legal and administrative practices were also shaped indirectly by prisoners. Reforms, however inconsistent, often arose in response to the hardships experienced by inmates. Decrees regulating diet, labor, punishment, and visitation reflect recognition of prisoners' humanity, however imperfectly applied. While corruption, inefficiency, and neglect limited the impact of these reforms, the efforts themselves reveal a tension between authority and ethics. a recognition that justice and confinement were intertwined with responsibility. These early experiments in prison regulation influenced later approaches to incarceration, contributing to evolving ideas about governance, law, and humane treatment. Psychologically, prisoners left a legacy of resilience and adaptability. Enduring disease, overcrowding, monotony, and uncertainty required remarkable ingenuity and patience. Social strategies, alliances, mentorship, negotiation, and resource sharing revealed the human capacity to create structure, community, and meaning, even under extreme stress. These lessons, while often invisible in historical accounts, highlight universal truths about survival, that human beings rely on cooperation, creativity, and perseverance to navigate adversity, whether in prisons of the past or the challenges of contemporary life. Even the marginalized or forgotten, women, children, and debtors, contributed to this legacy. Their survival strategies, moral courage, and quiet acts of endurance shaped families, communities, and institutions. They preserved cultural practices, maintained moral and religious observances, and nurtured intellectual and social continuity. Though absent from official histories, their influence endured through generations, leaving subtle imprints on societal norms and collective memory. Finally, the legacy of prisoners reminds us of the complexity of human experience. They were not merely victims of circumstance or instruments of political strategy. They were active participants in survival, negotiation, and resistance. Their lives demonstrate that even in confinement, people exercise agency, preserve dignity, and shape the world around them in ways both subtle and profound. As this exploration draws to a close, it becomes clear that the story of Caliphate prisoners is not only about walls, chains, and deprivation. It is about endurance, ingenuity, and the quiet yet enduring influence of those often forgotten by history. Their lives, though constrained, left a legacy of resilience, compassion, and insight, a testament to the human spirit that persists even in the most challenging circumstances. With this reflection, the journey ends gently, inviting contemplation of the past and appreciation for the often invisible threads of human experience that connect history, memory, and the present.